teaching about music. But teaching music as part of the quadrivium is not simply having students make music together, but it is studying the theory behind how music works. The quadrivium is comprised of 4 subjects: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And at first glance, it seems that music is the odd one out on the list. Arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy are all related by their numbers and measurements, but music doesn't really bring to mind equations for most people. Despite that, music and math are very closely related, as we'll see. Without math, music wouldn't work. Music is what happens when you hear math, whether it's a single note full of its own overtones and sound waves, or a combination of notes that have even more complex relationships and patterns. And since math is what makes music work, it is important to understand the math behind the music. And for our purposes today, that means understanding music theory. Students at my school, Mount Hope, love to sing, and they love to make music. But learning how to sing isn't music theory. Music theory is knowing everything behind music, like notes, scales, modes, chords, and harmonic and melodic rules that produce good music. Teaching the theory behind music will make students better musicians and help them to create and compose better music themselves. Now, if we go back about 1,500 years, we can see how Boethius, an influential writer on philosophy as well as music, thought about music. Boethius wrote the Cultivating Musica, or the Fundamentals of Music, which became one of the most influential resources for teaching music in the Middle Ages. It drew heavily on ancient Greek thought and also things like Pythagoras and his ratios. In this work, Boethius compares the man who only knows how to play a musical instrument to a mere slave just performing a task. So, rather demeaning for those of us who play instruments. But he also says that the true musician is the one who understands the theory behind the music. He might not even play a musical instrument himself, but the true musician is the one who knows the theory. So Boethius prizes knowledge of music theory much more highly than he does the abilities of individual musicians and the actual deed of making music. Just as without a good architect, no amount of labor will produce a skyscraper, without a good background in music theory, no amount of just humming or whistling will make an intricate symphony. So it's important to have that background to make music actually happen. Now, this is not to belittle those who enjoy making music. I myself used to be a mere slave, as we used to say, and I quite enjoyed it. That's because we know from God's word that we're supposed to make music to God. And the great Lutheran musicians of the Baroque and the Reformation times were great because they knew that they could combine their love of praising God and making music to Him with the theory behind how it works. And when they combined those two things together, that's where some of the greatest music ever written happened. So we're going to be talking today about Lutheran hymns as our resource for teaching music theory. You can use them for showing students everything from how to draw a treble clef, or notate middle C, all the way to seeing whether a particular melody fits into Dorian mode or Phrygian mode. Each hymn will reliably contain solid musical material to analyze, especially if you are using TLH. Side note, LSB sometimes only has the melody in the Q edition, as you probably know. So at our school we use TLH because then you get the soprano, alto, tenor, bass in each hymn. So today, we will be using hymns to discuss music theory, and at the very end of your handout, I've included some resources for just different ideas you can peruse at your leisure. And today, the hymn that we are going to be using, and hopefully you all got, is Lamb of God, Pure and Holy. So, real quick show of hands, who already knows how to read music or plays an instrument? Yes. All right, we're in good company. So some of you will already know a lot of the terms that we'll be using, but I'll still try to provide definitions as we work our way from pretty basic things all the way up to more complex analysis. Feel free to raise your hand anytime during the presentation if you have a question or want me to explain something. And I'll also save some time for questions at the end. So if we start at the beginning of learning music, you need to learn how to read the notes. And I assume that most of you know that notes are arranged on lines and spaces in treble clef and bass clef to show distances up and down in pitch. They are lettered A through G, there's no H, so stop little students from writing H with a note, it doesn't exist. Notes can be altered by raising or lowering them a half step. You can see on your little piano keyboard chart how if you raise a note like C a half step, it would turn into C sharp. Or you could lower it a half step, just a small interval, next door neighbor, that would be called a C flat. So half steps are just that smallest interval you could have between two notes. And this is how the black keys on the piano are named, after the white key just above or below it, depending on the situation. Because of the way that sharps and flats work, you can see how C sharp is actually the same note as D flat. The note in between C and D has two different names, so we call C sharp and D flat enharmonically equivalent. And so to practice our skill of naming notes, I'd like you to turn the page to page 2 of your handout. And this is where you get to test out your note reading abilities. And we're going to name the notes of this part of the hymn together. So this is what we're looking at. So is there anyone brave enough to tell us what the first note is? Yes, it's a D. So you can also reference this chart if you need help finding where the D is. So we have a D as our first note. Any brave soul want to name the second note?
F sharp.
Thank you, it's F sharp. Good job looking at the key signature at the beginning there. Not just F, F sharp. So what is the third and fourth and fifth note of this? Anyone? It's an A, good job. So we have an A, and then quite alphabetically, the next note following is B. And then we just have A, B, A. So pretty clear. Anyone want to venture to give me the entire third measure? Yes. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So that's by step. So if you know your alphabet, just go straight from D all the way to G. And then the last two are E, which we've already seen, and T again. So this is important for teaching theory, just to know your notes. So another aspect of analyzing a hymn is not only the notes, but the rhythm. So in the excerpt just below from Lamb of God, Pure and Holy, we're going to talk about the time signature at the beginning of the line. So the top number, the 4, tells you how many beats there are in a measure, which is just that space between the vertical lines. And then the bottom number, the 2, tells you what note gets the beat. So in our case, we've got 4 half notes. If the bottom number had been 4/4 like this, we would have had 4 quarter notes. So in this example, the second one where it says the third phrase of the hymn, I put no measure lines in there except for like the pickup note at the beginning, but no measure lines intentionally so that you can draw the measure lines into your music. So if we're just going to ignore that first note, it's from a different measure. But if you look at our time signature, we need 4 half notes. So that's pretty easy. A half note, if you look at your chart where it says the 2 beats and then the note following it, that's like hollow with a stem, that's your half note. So if you count 4 of those, and you can put a line, and you can also just cheat and look at your hymn, but don't do that. And then you have that A, G sharp, A, and then we come to something called a rest. And if you reference your little chart, you can see that that rest is equal to 1 beat. And so really you should put the line for your measure 1 quarter note after that at the A. Okay, now you've got another complete measure with 4 half notes. And then even though this dotted quarter and 8th note looks a little bit trickier, if you add up the dotted quarter and the 8th note, that equals 2 beats. If you add up the 2 quarter notes following that, the F sharp and the B, that's 2 beats. 2 beats for the A next, and then the last note there is 2 beats for the F sharp, so you've got 4 half notes in that measure too. So a great way to teach rhythm. Take out all of the measure lines and put them back in. The trickier the better. You can pick easy hymns to do this with or difficult ones. So another thing you need to know to understand music theory, besides reading notes, understanding rhythm, is understanding intervals. An interval is just the space between a pair of notes, any two. And so you have an interval chart at the bottom of page 2. And I've made all of my intervals start on the note C. You don't have to choose C, but I did that. I'm just going to kind of walk you through all the intervals and talk about them and play them. So intervals are comprised of half steps, which was the smallest interval between two notes. So if you have just one half step, it sounds like this, and it's called a minor second. Why you have that lowercase m and the 2 minor second. So if you think of, that's a half step right there. So we've got, for our minor second, for our major second, we're adding one more half step, so it's just going to get a little bigger. Our major second sounds like this. Okay. Now if we have minor second and major second, you'd think this is a pattern, and you'd be right. We're going to have a minor third and a major third next. So this is a minor third. Okay, this is a major third. Getting bigger by one half step every time. Now the pattern stops, and we don't have a minor fourth. We don't have a minor fourth next. That doesn't exist. So when we get to the fourths and the fifths, it changes from being major or minor into being what we call a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth. Now, fourths and fifths have an interesting relationship with each other, because when you take a fourth, like from C to F, and I'm going to put that F an octave lower, and now if I play from F to C, that's actually a perfect fifth. So if I switch the notes of a fourth or a fifth, I end up getting the other one when you invert them. So that's kind of the relationship between fourths and fifths. And you'll notice that in between fourths and fifths, there's another interval called the tritone. This used to be called the devil in music. Composers avoided it like the plague because it sounds like this. A lovely sound, we can all agree. So tritones are called tritones because there are 3 whole steps or steps. So we're going to continue with our pattern. So the rest of the intervals that are possible are minor sixth. Oh, my apologies. That was the major sixth. Now I'll do the minor sixth. Okay. Skipping over to the minor seventh. Okay, and the very last one is the major seventh until we get to a perfect octave. And a perfect octave is where you have both the notes the same, so we have a C and a C. So those are your intervals. Very useful for understanding theory. And if you turn over to page 3, I have gone ahead and analyzed the first little melody of Lamb of God with intervals. So the first interval of the hymn is one of those major thirds. Minor third, major second, descend to perfect fifth, major second, minor third, major second. So intervals happen all over the place, and it's once you know them, then you can use them to your benefit. Because each of them have their own characteristics. So another thing useful to know for music theory is knowing about the key signature. So someone already said that a particular note was F sharp instead of F because right here at the beginning, you see that there's 2 sharp signs. And those tell you that certain notes are sharp. So the way they found out that we needed these 2 notes sharp is because in keys, you have a certain pattern of half steps and whole steps that make up what we call a scale, which is just the distance from a C to the next C, or just any octave. So if we have this hymn sheet, which you can all see, the key of this hymn is in D major, and if you're not the most experienced at finding out the key, an easy way to know what key we're in is you look at the first note we have in the melody, and it's in D. and you look at the last note we have in the melody, it's a D. You look at the bass clef, if you can read bass clef, and you can see that the basses are singing a D in the first chord, and you can also look at what the basses are singing in the very last chord, and that's also a D. All of this evidence leads us to conclude that this hymn is in D major, which it doesn't have to be in D major, but it just positions the melody so that it's in a nice range for the human voice. And so it's really helpful for finding keys to know about two things, scales and the circle of fifths. So on your handout on page 3, you've got some scales. And as many of you already know, a scale is just like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And those notes are arranged whole step, half step, whole step, half step. And so that's like our recipe for making a major scale. And if you change one of the ingredients in that recipe, it's going to sound wrong to our ears. So I'm going to change it intentionally. I'm going to flip the 1 from being the half step at the end. I'm going to switch it with the one right before it, and you're going to hear how when I switch the last 2 intervals in my recipe that it's going to sound a little strange. So here's a weird major scale. That's what happens when you switch that last 2 and 1. But if I put them back where they're supposed to be, then it sounds right. So the same thing goes for minor scales. There's 3 different kinds of minor scales. We're not going to get to all of them today, but the one that's most commonly used in hymns is the harmonic minor scale. I can play that one for you. The harmonic minor scale is made up of these kinds of half steps. So 2 half steps, 1 half step, 2 half steps, 2 half steps, 1 half step, 3 half steps, and 1 half step. It sounds like this. Hear those intervals at the end. So now that you know from your major scale the recipe of the whole steps or the 2 and the half steps or the 1 that you need, we're going to try to make our own D major scale at the bottom of the page using half steps and whole steps to work our way up, starting on D and getting all the way up to the next D. So I want everyone to start just by writing a D where you're going to make your own scale. So put that D on the space right below the bottom line. Okay? And is there anyone who can tell me if we need a whole step, so 2 half steps, between D and the next note? What should the next note of our scale be? E, okay. Correct, so put an E there, that'll be the bottom line of your music. All right, so looking again at our little chart, we need another whole step between the E and the next note. So what should the next note be? So it's a kind of F. We know it's a kind of F. Our options are F flat, F, or F sharp. But because we need 2 half steps from E to F is only 1, but from E to F sharp is 2. So F sharp is correct. Put a little sharp sign, and then do an F on your bottom space. Just keep going up lines and spaces as we go. All right. From F sharp to our next note is going to be a half step, the smallest possible interval. So what note would that be? G. That's going to be a G. So put a G there. All right, and I'm looking back up at my recipe for a major scale. After that half step comes a whole step. So what's a whole step after G? A. What's another whole step after A? B. Okay, what's another whole step after B? Trick question.
C sharp.
C sharp, yep, you got it. And then what's the last note? D, because we started on D and we're ending on D. So you can fill in the rest of your notes ending on D, and now you've created your own major scale using the proper recipe, and it sounds like this. With that F sharp and that C sharp making it happen. Yes, the answer is there if you turn the page. All right. So we're going to talk about triads next. all the notes of the D major scale that we just made are the notes that are going to make our triads. A triad is just 3 notes. Now you'll notice that on our hymn there are 4 notes at the beginning, and you might be asking, is that really a triad if there are 4? But the D and the soprano and the D and the bass are the same note, so we don't count it twice. There's 3 notes in our triads, at least for today's purposes. So a triad is comprised of 3 notes, with the bottom one being a third, we talked about thirds, away from the middle one, and the middle notes being a third away from the top one. So between the bottom notes of your triad and the top note, there's a fifth. A perfect fifth is the distance. So you can have this one called the root, this one called the third, and this one called the fifth. And there's our triad. And so a D major triad would sound like this. But triads, remember we talked about how we have minor thirds, which are slightly smaller, and major thirds, which are slightly larger. And we have 2 positions that our thirds could be in, either the bottom third or the top third. So if we have 2 kinds of thirds and 2 positions, that means we could have how many different combinations? We could have 4 possible combinations. You could have a major third with a minor third on top. You could have a minor third with a major third on top. You could have a major third and a major third on top, or you could have a minor third and a minor third. So those are 4 different kinds of chords that you could possibly end up with, and I'll just play them. So this is the one you get when you have a major third and then a minor third, and we call it a major triad. Now, I'm going to make the minor third on bottom and put the major third on top, and this is a minor triad. Okay, just a very slight change. Now I'm going to go back to my major third and put another major third on top, and here's what that sounds like. It's called an augmented chord because of 2 majors making it rather large. So my augmented triad, okay, kind of spooky. And then if I have 2 minor thirds, this is called a diminished chord because 2 minors, kind of small, makes it into a smaller sounding chord. So this is the diminished. Again, not quite as pleasant as the major chords or the minor chords. So all of these chords are what the chords in our hymns can be classified as. And if you look at this next illustration, you can see that I've taken every note of the D major scale and I've made it the root of its own triad. So I've built a triad on top of each one of those scale notes. And I only use notes that were already a part of the scale. So if you look at the first one where it says tonic, or like the 1 chord underneath it, you can see that it's D, F sharp, A, and the F sharp is in the scale already, so I had to keep that. That's why we have all of those in place. So the possible triads you can have are, they sound like this. This is your tonic, or your 1 chord, and it has a capital, like, Roman numeral I under it because it's major. If it has a lowercase, that means it's minor. So our next one, the supertonic, is minor. Our next one again is going to be minor. The 4 chord, major. The 5 chord, major again. The 6 chord, minor. And then here's a diminished one, the little degree sign after your 7. That means diminished. And then your last one, we're back where we started at the tonic with that major 1 chord. So maybe if you play guitar, you're used to looking at a chord and labeling it like D major or whatever. But for music theorists, because there are different keys you can be in, a D major chord for us is our 1 chord. But in another key, a D major chord isn't 1, it might be 5 or something like that. And so rather than labeling each chord by its letters, like D or E or F sharp, we label it with numbers, and these numbers stay the same, even though the individual chords that might make that happen. Like if you were in C major, your 1 chord is C, E, G, but if you're in D major, your 1 chord is D, F sharp, A. So your 1 chord in different keys might have different notes, but they're both called 1 chord. So it's nice to have that system for talking about things because they stay consistent, even though the key you might be in will change and not be consistent. So chords have relationships with each other that we often see in hymns, as we'll get to in our hymn today. And these relationships are like tendencies that they want to move to the next chord. And so these can be called chord progressions. We're going to look at really simple chord progressions that are just two chords, a pair, called cadences. So you'll notice I've listed 4 different types of cadences to talk about right here. And so I'll just play the authentic cadence. This is how a lot of hymns end. This is actually how our hymn for today, Lamb of God, Pure and Holy, ends. So it has a 5 chord and then a 1 chord. And to our ears, that sounds right. That sounds complete. All right. Another kind of relationship is where you end not on the 1 chord, but on the 5 chord, or like the dominant chord. So this chord is the half cadence. So I'm going to play the half cadence for you. And if you heard that, it would usually be in the middle of a hymn somewhere, and it would give you a momentary sense of repose, but it's not really as complete as getting to that 1 chord again. The next cadence, called plagal, is your typical amen cadence, so it happens all the time. It should be pretty familiar to you. Okay, that's 4 going to 1. That's what that sounds like. And then the last one is called deceptive. It's one of my favorites. It's tricking you, basically. You see that there's a 5 chord, and we've already seen an authentic cadence. That 5 wants to go to 1. It wants to go back home, basically. But in the deceptive cadence, it deceives you, and it takes you to 6 instead of to 1. It sounds like this. It gives you a minor chord instead of what you were expecting as a major chord. So going to that is an interesting twist if you ever want to deceive people in your music, throw in a deceptive cadence. So now it would be pretty boring if triads were always root, third, fifth, okay? If they were locked into that order when you see them. They're not locked into that order. You can switch the notes around and have different ones on bottom, different ones on top. So if you have your triad, it can be in what we call root position, which means that the root is the bottom note. You're on that foundation of the root. But what if I played leapfrog? And in my case, the root is D. I play leapfrog and I put the D, now it's the top note. So this is, if you look at your second chord here with the inversions, it's the 1/6 chord. The 6 is a little number that tells you that between the F sharp, which is now at the bottom, and the D, which I moved to the top, there's an interval of a 6 between them now. So the 6 tells you that. Okay, what if I play leapfrog again, and I take the F sharp, which used to be at the bottom, and I put it at the top. Okay, now I have A, D, F sharp. You can see the 1/6/4 chord on your page. Okay, that's what happens when you have now moved it one more time. The same thing you can do with your 5 chord. I've just listed those there. Playing leapfrog, moving the bottom note to the top until you can't do it anymore. So if I play my root position, 1 chord, my first inversion, my second inversion, and then I can get back to root position, and it would sound like that. So inversions are very handy for making your hymn sound a little less just like block, block, block. Because when you switch the notes around, you can create beautiful vocal lines for your altos and tenors and basses. So we can go ahead and turn the page. And the next thing I want to talk about is this rather amazing circle of fifths. So a circle of fifths, I hinted at this, D major isn't the only key that exists, even though it's the key of our hymn. There are 12 major keys that exist. So you see the capital letters starting with C. Those are all of our major keys on the outside of the ring. And then there are 12 minor keys that exist, and those are the lowercase letters on the inside of the ring. A would be at the top of the minors. So in total, you have 24 possible keys that you could compose with. And this circle of fifths is a really handy chart for keeping all 24 of them straight and showing you the relationship from one to another. So if we start at C at the top, C major requires no sharps or flats to make it happen. If you imagine that you're going a perfect fifth. All right, this is called the circle of fifths for a reason. You're going a perfect fifth from C to G. Okay, that's going to be our next key that's most closely related to C. And G major, has only one difference, which is an F sharp, for those of you who are already familiar. And the reason we need that F sharp in there, the reason an F natural would not do, is because you need to keep that recipe of half steps and whole steps for your major scale the same, even though we shifted our starting up to G now instead of C. So a G major scale without the F sharp would sound like this. But with the F sharp, it sounds right. And the same pattern continues as we move clockwise around the circle of fifths. Every time you move a fifth over, so the interval between G and D is a fifth. In D, you need to make sure that that last note right before you get to the tonic again is raised to be that half step. So the note right before D is C, therefore you need a C sharp to get to D major. Same pattern with A, you need a G sharp right before your A to have A major. You keep retaining the sharps you have and adding one more every time. And you can get all the way, going with this pattern, to 7 sharps over at C sharp major. Now if we go back to the top of our circle of fifths chart to C again, you can go down a fifth on the piano and you'll get to F. So now we're going counterclockwise around our chart. And instead of adding sharps, we're adding flats. So flats are those symbols that make notes go down a half step. So in order for our F major scale to sound correct, we need to add a B flat. If I play it without a B flat, just only white keys, here's what it sounds like. Slightly odd, okay? But if I add that B flat, it's correct. And so we're not going to have time to talk about all of the flat keys on that side of your chart today, but that's all right. And then you also have the lowercase letters, which those are the minor keys. I'll talk about that briefly. So each major key has a minor key that is related to it. So you notice that C major has A minor related to it. And the reason that C and A are paired together is because when you shift all of the notes down a minor third from C major, you shift them all down a minor third, you end up with A minor. So A minor has no sharps or flats, just like C major. And I can play that for you, no sharps or flats, just starting on an A and ending on an A. And every major key has a corresponding minor key that goes with it, and then they share the same key signature. So really, our hymn that was in D major could be in B minor, except it's not, because it quite obviously starts with major chords and ends with major chords. All right, so that's your circle of fifths chart. It has a lot of great information, and if you're teaching music theory, memorizing it, knowing all of the different keys on it would be greatly to your advantage as you look at hymns that might have all of these different keys depending on which hymns you're turning to. All right, so I think finally we should talk about analyzing this hymn. We have 6 steps for analyzing a hymn or any piece of classical music for that matter. The first step, this is at the bottom of page 5, is to find the key. Okay, we already did that. We figured out it was D major. We could check the circle of fifths charts, or we could just see the first chord is D major and the last chord is D major. Okay, second step, write out the scale. Hopefully that's already done. You wrote out your D major scale. Okay, so you know the notes. Third step, make triads for each note of the scale. Okay, we had that chart already, so you know the triads. And then step 4, you label the triads with Roman numerals. So we remember every chord can be represented as a Roman numeral. I've already done line 3 and line 4 of this hymn, so you can see how that looks. Write the chord names above each triad. I made a little chart for you at the top where each triad has the names of the notes. So like the first one, D, F sharp, A. Okay, so on your hymn sheet that can tell you what we're looking at as far as the chords in this hymn and the notes in each one. All right, and once you've set yourself up, you know the key, you know the chords, you know the note names of the chords, if that's helpful for you, then you can go to step 6, which is actually do the music theory analysis for this hymn. And you can write Roman numerals under every chord. You can mark the cadences that might be used at the end of phrases, okay? There's a few authentic cadences in this hymn that you see, a few half cadence in there. And you can note that some places that have accidentals are actually venturing into a different key. We might have time to talk about that, but that happens frequently in hymns. For instance, the Only Son from Heaven starts in F major, and I just want you to hear how it goes into D minor, how F major and D minor are so closely related. Okay, so sometimes hymns will shift between keys, and that's the fun of it. But we're going to look at our hymn for today in particular and see if we can analyze some of these chords. I intentionally left the first line mostly blank so that we could do that together. All right? So take a look at your very first chord on the word lamb. Okay, in the bass we've got a D. In the tenor we have an F sharp. In the altos we have an A, and in the sopranos we have a D. Now, if I'm going to put a Roman numeral underneath this chord to analyze it, does anyone want to tell me which Roman numeral to put? Yeah? Did someone do this for a 1 chord? You are correct. So we have a 1 chord, that's our tonic. All right, good. You can all put a capital major 1 underneath that. So your second chord, this is change of notes. So we've got B in the bass, B in the tenor, D in the altos, F sharp in the sopranos. Can you match that up with one of our chord options? Which one would that be? Yes, correct. You can be bold and say it out loud. Okay, it's a minor 6 chord. So if I were analyzing this with my high school music theory class, they would all just put a minor 6 Roman numeral under that. So far, all of our triads that we've seen, the first one and the second one, have had the root of the chord in the bass. So we haven't had to worry about putting any numbers next to it, those little kind of exponent looking things. So that's good. Now the third chord, F sharp in the bass, A in the tenor, C sharp in the alto, and an A in the soprano. Can you match that F sharp, A, C sharp with anything on our chord chart? Does that look like anything?
Minor third.
Hey, it is. So we've got a minor 3 chord there. And then I'll give you the next 2 for pure and. Those are the same thing as each other, as you can see. They're the same notes as your 1 chord. Even though they look a little different from our very first chord of the hymn, they're the same notes. We've just flipped the order of the soprano and alto. All right, so coming up next on the word holy, we have a half cadence. We talked about how a half cadence is like halfway complete because it ends on the 5 chord, not the 1 chord. So there's that example of it happening there. All right, sort of an incomplete sound there. But then we move on to the chord on who. Now, is there anyone who would like to tell me what who is? I'll give you a hint. We've already seen it in the first measure.
Minor third.
Yes, it is a minor 3 chord. So it's the same as the chord on God, actually, except the bass is just moved down an octave. So you can label that 1. And then if we go to the next chord, the word on. Okay, we've already seen these notes actually in the first measure. Would anyone like to tell me what chord I should call this one? Roman numeral wise. All right, so if you look at the bass, we've got a B in the bass, an F sharp in the tenor, a B again in the alto, and a D in the soprano. So I'm looking for something that has B, D, and F sharp in it. And if I glance through my options, I get to the sixth chord over here. B, D, F sharp are the notes involved. So I can call that a sixth chord. And you can continue just analyzing all of the chords. And then once you get to the end of your hymn, you'll, which I've already done that for you, got the third and fourth line done. But you can just see how some of these chords relate. You can find different cadences that are present in the hymn. And I think we should all sing it. How does that sound? Let's sing this together. Ready? And. Hopefully this presentation was a useful introduction to music theory or a helpful refresher, and I hope it encourages you to incorporate music theory into your teaching through Lutheran hymns, so that the next generation of Lutherans have the right tools for making music to God's glory. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I don't know if I missed it at the beginning, but what age kids are you using this with? And are you adding each part that you're doing little by little?
So on the very last page of your handout, you can see I've broken down into beginner, intermediate, and advanced the different levels of things I would consider. So with beginner, that's basically like kindergarten through third-ish grade, any point during that time. Intermediate, I'm thinking more middle grades, and then advanced is more the high school level music. So what we cover today from just this 45 minutes is what basically a college music theory 1 course we get to. So we've gone quite far, but yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Kids who have a natural sixth sense of music, and they are slaves to, slaves to instruments.
Without knowing the theory behind it. Yeah.
How do you inspire them to want to learn?
Yeah. I think you show them that you can only get so far with natural talent, but when you add theory to it, you can go even farther than you could have imagined. For myself personally, learning theory opened up organ improvisation to me because I was able to use chords and improvise more based on that. Things that I would not have understood had I not known what the chords really meant. So I would encourage just how far it can take you once you are equipped with those things. Any other questions? All right, there.
To go off of that, if you think about things like this as like pixels, you can think that if you know music theory, you can think about it in terms of brushstrokes. You understand not only what you're playing, but why. One of the things I didn't have when I was a younger music student was a good understanding of why that chord is doing what it's doing right there. So you can start to see why You know, you got 10 fingers and Debussy wrote an 11-note chord. Where is that chord going? You're not going to sight read that. But if you understand the motion that makes that chord and why he's going that direction, that's what makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right. Well, thank you all.